My name is Katherine Stevenson, and I grew up in a family I always considered the perfect American family. We weren't wealthy, but our home was filled with warmth and genuine joy. Our small but cozy house resonated with laughter, the smell of homemade pastries, and endless conversations. There were three of us: me, my mother Vanessa, and my father David. My father, David Stevenson, was someone I always saw as the embodiment of hard work and strength. He started his business with just 2 trucks and often drove them himself to deliver important cargo. In the early years, he'd come home exhausted, his boots covered in dust and his smile faint. I remember once when he brought me a small figurine of a Greek god from one of his trips. At the time, I didn't understand why. "It's for inspiration, princess," he said, his voice brimming with a profound faith in the future. That figurine still sits on the shelf in my room. My mother Vanessa was working as a manager at a local restaurant back then. She didn't like her job, often complaining about late shifts and fatigue. "I want to be a real housewife," she'd say during dinner. Dad would reassure her, promising that soon she could leave it all behind and focus on our home. When I was little, his promises always came true. When I turned 9, my father's business began to thrive. He secured a few major contracts, and soon we moved into a 2-story house in a beautiful neighborhood surrounded by green lawns and tall trees. My new room felt like a fairy tale: lavender-colored walls, a bookshelf my father built himself, and a window that overlooked our garden. I remember him muttering to himself in frustration as he assembled the bookshelf, but his face shone with pride when he finally finished. Mom, just as she'd always dreamed, quit her job and dedicated herself to the house. Though, in reality, her dedication mostly meant lunches with friends, long shopping trips, and endless visits to beauty salons. I always felt that Dad didn't notice her absence. He was too consumed by work. Yet every Sunday, he found time for me. We'd go out for ice cream, and he'd listen to my stories about school and friends as though they were the most important things in the world. The last time we had ice cream together was the day before my 11th birthday. It was a sunny spring day, and I had no idea this moment would become a memory I'd carry with me forever. We sat on a bench in the park, and he told me about his plans. One of his drivers had fallen ill, and he had to take a night shift himself. "Dad, can I come with you?" I asked excitedly. He chuckled, ruffled my hair, and said, "Not this time, princess. It's just a short trip. I'll be back before you even start to miss me." That night, I hugged him tightly before bed. "I love you, Dad," I said, not knowing these would be the last words I'd ever say to him. At dawn, he was already gone. Mom was still asleep when he left in his truck, taking with him the breakfast our nanny Maria had prepared. The call came deep in the night, at 3:47. I remember it exactly because I couldn't sleep that night, plagued by a strange feeling of unease. First, I heard my mother scream from her bedroom. Then, the sound of something heavy falling. I didn't need to leave my room to understand. Our perfect world had just collapsed. The next few hours after that call were a suffocating blur. Police officers sat in our living room, their faces serious yet detached, as if trying not to meet our eyes. Maria held me tightly, as though trying to shield me from the reality crashing down around us. Mom paced the room, clutching the phone in her hand, her voice oscillating between hysterical shrieks and barely audible whispers. The words I heard then hit like thunderclaps: massive collision, overturned, instant death. They swirled around me like dark butterflies, making it impossible to breathe. My dad's truck had collided with a semi-trailer, which flipped his truck across the highway. The police said he didn't suffer, that it happened instantly. Their words seemed meant to comfort us, but they only deepened my pain. As if the absence of suffering made any of it easier. But nothing could make it easier. Nothing could bring my dad back. The funeral, like the first days after his death, is a hazy memory. I remember standing in front of the closed casket, unable to believe my dad was inside. His face, his voice, his smile, they all seemed too vivid, too alive to fit into that cold box. Mom put on quite a show. Her loud sobs, abruptly cutting off mid-sentence, and her dramatic gasps eventually turned into a full performance as she practically threw herself onto the casket, crying his name. Back then, I thought that was how adults dealt with grief. Now I understand how much of it was for show. It was at the funeral that I met Uncle Robert and Aunt Patricia for the first time. They stood a little apart from the crowd, unfamiliar and distant, like shadows from another world. Uncle Robert had the same eyes as Dad, with wrinkles at the corners that deepened when he tried to smile through his tears. He approached me, knelt down to my level, and said softly, "Catherine, I'm so sorry we're meeting like this. I'm your father's brother." I stared at him without looking away and, as only a child can, asked bluntly, "Why haven't I seen you before?" A shadow passed over his face, as though he was remembering something he didn't want to share. "Your father and I had a falling out many years ago. But that doesn't matter now. I had to come and say goodbye to my younger brother," he said, his voice trembling, though he quickly composed himself. After the funeral, everything began to change. My mother's grief, which had seemed so profound, dissipated faster than morning mist. Within weeks, she was meeting with my father's lawyers, discussing the future of his company. She talked about restructuring, modernization, and other concepts she clearly didn't understand but pretended to know all about. I started spending more and more time with Maria. She would shake her head sadly whenever my mother came home with yet another set of bags from expensive stores. One day, as she was preparing my lunch, Maria said quietly, "Your mother is spending money like water. And those poor drivers haven't been paid in weeks." I looked at her, not fully understanding what she meant, but soon it all became clear. My father's employees, the men and women who had worked for him for years, began to leave. They couldn't feed their families on promises and excuses. I remembered their faces, their kind smiles, how they used to bring me little souvenirs from their routes, wooden figurines, seashells, colorful bracelets. But now, they were gone. 6 months later, my mother sold off what remained of the company for next to nothing. She announced it as a profitable deal, but everyone knew the truth. She had destroyed what my father had spent his entire life building. After the company was sold, my mother was rarely home. She was always out, leaving me behind with Maria. We spent so much time together that Maria started teaching me Spanish. "It will come in handy one day," she said, her voice carrying a warmth that reminded me of my father. I began spending a lot of time at the library after school. It became my refuge, a place where I could escape the increasingly bleak reality of my life. Books became my friends. Within their pages, I found worlds that offered comfort, order, and justice, everything that was so absent in my own life. I dreaded going home. Our house, once cozy and warm, had turned cold and empty, steeped in loneliness. My mother would come home late, often smelling of wine or heavy perfume, as if trying to erase every trace of the past. "Oh, you're still up," she'd say upon entering my room, as though she'd stumbled upon me by accident. Her voice was full of fake surprise, as if she'd forgotten I even existed. She would quickly retreat to her bedroom, leaving me alone in the darkness. The next day, she might not even be home at all. But one day, everything changed. It was a Sunday evening. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my textbook spread out when the door burst open. My mother walked in, laughing, as if she'd just returned from a party, even though the night had barely begun. She wasn't alone. "Catherine, sweetheart, come here." Her voice was too loud, too cheerful, and it immediately put me on edge. Standing next to her was a man. Tall, with closely cropped hair, he was dressed in an expensive suit that somehow still looked cheap because of his awkward demeanor. His smile didn't reach his eyes, and there was something unsettling about it. "This is Richard," my mother announced with so much enthusiasm that I instantly knew something big was about to happen. She was gripping his hand tightly, as if afraid he'd vanish if she let go. "Catherine," she began, smiling so broadly it looked almost painful. "Richard and I got married last weekend. He's your new father. We're going to be a real family again." The words caught in my throat. I already had a real family, I blurted out, my voice trembling. My mother looked at me as though I'd just said something obscene. Richard, meanwhile, smirked, but his grin vanished as he leaned toward me. "Listen here, young lady," he said, his voice cold and stern. "Your mother and I are married now. You need to accept that and show some respect." "You're not my father," I snapped, feeling a surge of anger welling up inside me. "And you never will be." His face darkened. He turned to my mother. "A difficult child needs discipline," he said quietly but firmly. My mother didn't respond, she just lowered her gaze. But Richard's arrival was only the beginning. A week later, his entire family moved into our house, his mother Gloria, his sister Janet, and his 12-year-old niece Madison. They took over the house like an invading army. Gloria immediately took command of the kitchen, loudly complaining about Maria's cooking. "She uses too much grease," she told my mother, gesturing dramatically. Within days, Maria quit. My mother didn't even try to stop her. I lost the only person who truly cared about me. Then something happened that I couldn't forgive. One day, I came home from school and found Madison standing in my room. My room, with its lavender walls, string lights, and the bookshelf my father had built. She was going through my books, tossing them onto the floor. "What are you doing?" I yelled, rushing in. Madison smirked. "Aunt Vanessa said I could have this room," she replied. "This is my room." I shouted, but she just shrugged. "It's bigger than the guest room, and I need space for all my stuff," she said, as if that explanation should pacify me. She continued rifling through my belongings, acting as though I wasn't even there. "Mom said you're moving to the small room at the end of the hall," she added with a smirk. At that moment, I lost control. I lunged at her, knocking her to the ground. We tumbled to the floor in a tangle of arms and legs. I yanked at her hair, and she scratched at my face. We were both screaming. I don't know how long it lasted, but eventually, my mother and Richard pulled us apart. "Catherine," my mother yelled, grabbing my arm. "How dare you? Go to your new room right now." "No!" I screamed, struggling to break free. "This is my room. Dad built it for me." Richard grabbed my shoulders sharply and pulled me down. His eyes were cold, and his voice was filled with fury. "Your father is dead," he snarled, gripping my arms so tightly I nearly cried out. "This is my house now, and you will do as you're told." They locked me in the small guest room, cold and lifeless, more like a prison cell than a place to live. I stayed there for 2 days, like a prisoner. I was only let out for school and bathroom breaks. My belongings, my books, everything that connected me to Dad and our past, were packed away into boxes, as though they wanted to erase me from this house entirely. Even the bookshelf Dad had built with his own hands was thrown out like garbage. Through the wall, I could hear Madison blasting loud music in my old room, and downstairs, my mother laughed with Janet as if nothing had happened. As if I no longer existed. After that, I tried to make myself invisible. I stayed quiet, kept my head down, and avoided confrontation. But a few weeks later, late at night, I overheard something that shattered me. I was on my way to the bathroom when I accidentally heard a conversation. I froze, standing in the darkness on the staircase, hiding in the shadows. Richard's voice was low, but each word cut into me like a knife. "The girl's getting harder to deal with every day," he said, his voice dripping with irritation. "She's disrupting our family. Have you thought about finding her another home?" My heart stopped. "Another home?" my mother repeated. Her tone was surprisingly calm, almost contemplative. "You mean adoption?" she asked, and I felt my blood turn to ice at her detached indifference. "I think it could work," Janet interjected, her voice light, as though they were discussing something trivial. "She's still young enough. It would be better for everyone. Madison is scared of her after what happened. And honestly, she doesn't fit in here anymore." I ran back to my room, barely holding back tears. I buried my face in my pillow, telling myself, they can't mean it. It's just talk. Mom would never do that. Never. But the words I'd heard wouldn't leave me. They settled inside me like a cold, heavy stone I couldn't shake. I tried to convince myself it was just a conversation, but something in their voices told me they were serious. 2 months passed. I didn't expect anything special on my birthday. We hadn't celebrated it since Dad died, and I'd gotten used to that. But to my surprise, Uncle Robert and Aunt Patricia showed up at the door that day. "Happy birthday, Catherine," Uncle Robert said, pulling me into a warm, tight hug. His embrace was so genuine, so comforting, that tears immediately welled up in my eyes. His expression darkened when he saw Richard walk past us without even stopping to acknowledge them. Caught off guard, my mother hastily prepared dinner. She tried to play the role of a gracious hostess, but the tension in the air was so thick you could cut it with a knife. We sat in awkward silence until my mother suddenly cleared her throat and began to speak. "Robert, Patricia, I'm glad you're here. There's something I need to discuss." Her tone was light, almost casual, but something in it set me on edge. "Catherine is unhappy here," she continued, avoiding my gaze. "And honestly, so are we. She doesn't fit into our new family dynamic. I've decided to put her up for adoption." The words hit me like a physical blow. The conversation I'd overheard that night hadn't just been talk. It had been a decision. "After all, you and Patricia don't have children of your own," she went on, her tone falsely cheerful, as if discussing the weather. "Maybe you'd like to take her in. If not, I'll start looking for other families." The room spun around me. I couldn't breathe. On my birthday, she decided to give me away. Uncle Robert shot to his feet, his chair crashing to the floor behind him. His face was red with fury. "We'll take her," he growled, his voice so loud it seemed to shake the walls. "And you, Vanessa, are the most despicable excuse for a mother I have ever seen." Richard began to rise, his face twisting in anger, but one look from Uncle Robert made him sink back into his chair. "Patricia," Uncle Robert turned to his wife, his voice softening. "Help Catherine pack her things. We're leaving now." Without a word, Aunt Patricia walked over to me, gently wrapped her arm around my trembling shoulders, and led me upstairs. We packed my things hurriedly, almost chaotically. There wasn't much left, just clothes and a few small items I had managed to hold on to. I was crying so hard I could barely see. "Everything will be all right, sweetheart," Aunt Patricia whispered, stroking my hair. "You're with us now." I walked out of the house without looking back. My insides burned, but I knew I couldn't allow myself to stop. My mother didn't say a word, didn't make a single move to stop me. She just stood by the window, her silhouette a dark shadow against the glass. As Uncle Robert shut the car door, I heard Madison's voice. "Can I have her new room now?" she asked with fake innocence, followed by Janet's echoing laughter as we drove away. At first, everything was difficult. I would wake up in the middle of the night in my new room, disoriented, unsure of where I was. The room in Uncle Robert and Aunt Patricia's house was cozy, with soft pastel wallpaper and neat wooden furniture. But for a while, I felt out of place, like I didn't belong. Yet every morning, as the smell of coffee and bacon drifted from the kitchen, I would remember, I was home now. A real home. The adoption process happened quickly. My mother signed away her parental rights without hesitation, and it stung. But at the same time, it was a blessing. Her indifference freed me, like a knife cutting through ropes. When the court officially recognized Uncle Robert and Aunt Patricia as my legal parents, I felt a warmth in my chest that I hadn't felt in years. On paper, they became my mom and dad, but in my heart, they had been that from the very first day. One morning at breakfast, Uncle Robert set down his newspaper, smiling. "We've enrolled you in Riverside Prep," he said. "It's the best school in the district. We think you'll like it." His voice was so steady and confident that I immediately felt a sense of relief. I smiled back, even though part of me still felt nervous. Riverside really was a fresh start. Without the constant stress and tension that had surrounded me before, I was able to focus on my studies. My teachers noticed my progress, as did my new parents. They attended every school event, whether it was a play, a sports game, or a debate. Their faces would light up with pride, even if I lost or made mistakes. "You tried, and that's what matters," Aunt Patricia would always say, hugging me after each performance. They encouraged me in everything I did. Piano lessons, summer science camps, volunteering at the local animal shelter, whatever I wanted to try, they supported me. But not just with money, they were truly involved. Uncle Robert helped me with physics projects, even when he didn't fully understand them himself. Aunt Patricia sat with me while I practiced piano, patiently listening to even my clumsiest attempts. The pain of my mother's rejection gradually faded. It was replaced by a sense of warmth and security. I knew I was loved, truly, unconditionally. Over time, I stopped thinking about my mother. I stopped wondering whether she ever thought about me or regretted her decision. My present was too full and vibrant for there to be room for old wounds. At my high school graduation, I heard the loudest applause in the audience. It wasn't just Uncle Robert and Aunt Patricia, but also their extended family, who had embraced me as one of their own over the years. After the ceremony, we all went to a restaurant to celebrate. During dinner, Aunt Patricia smiled and placed her hand on my shoulder. "There's something we've been wanting to tell you," she said. I looked up at her, unsure of what to expect. "We've been saving for your college tuition since the day you came to live with us," Uncle Robert added. "We have enough now to send you to any school you choose." I could barely hold back my tears. They hadn't just taken me in, they had planned for my future and believed in me from the very beginning. I chose a business school at the state university, deciding to pursue a career as an investment manager. I wanted to become someone they could be proud of. College was an incredible experience. I threw myself into my studies, working hard and staying focused. By my junior year, I landed an internship at Goldman Sachs, which felt like a huge step forward. But one day, while home for a break, Aunt Patricia mentioned something that caught me off guard. "I saw your mother," she said as she set plates on the table. Her voice was calm, but her eyes carefully watched my reaction. "Where?" I asked, trying to keep my tone indifferent. "At the grocery store," she replied. "She has a son now. They're still living in your father's old house." With that family, I was surprised to feel nothing but mild curiosity. The life I had once known felt like a distant dream. A dream that now belonged to someone else. After graduation, I started working at Morgan Stanley, and it changed my life. My starting salary was more than I could have imagined right out of college. When I saw the numbers in my bank account for the first time, it took me a few minutes to process that this was the result of my hard work, determination, and the unwavering support of those who had stood by me. That same day, as soon as I received my first paycheck, I went straight to a jewelry store. I knew exactly what I wanted to do. Uncle Robert had worn the same old watch for years. It looked like it had weathered every hardship he had endured and survived, just like he had. Aunt Patricia, despite her modesty, had once mentioned that she'd always admired a pearl necklace in a store window. I remembered that moment. And now, finally, I could give them something in return, something they would never have bought for themselves. When I handed them their gifts, their reactions were exactly as I had imagined. Aunt Patricia pressed her hands to her face, her eyes filling with tears. "Oh, Catherine, this is too much, sweetheart. You shouldn't have spent so much." Uncle Robert, as he put on his new watch, looked at me with a slight tremble in his hand. "Who else would I spend it on?" I replied, wrapping my arms around them both. "You're my parents. You made all of this possible." We sat around the table, drinking tea and laughing, and for the first time, I felt like I could give something back for all the love they had given me. 6 years had passed since college, and I was rapidly climbing the career ladder. Each success was even sweeter because I could share it with Mom and Dad, what I now called Uncle Robert and Aunt Patricia. I bought my first apartment, a cozy two-bedroom in a great neighborhood. Aunt Patricia helped me pick out the furniture, while Uncle Robert insisted on personally reviewing all the paperwork before I signed anything. They were as excited as if it were their own home. It was around this time that I met Michael. We met at a corporate event, and a year later, he proposed during a beach trip. We were standing on the sand, the sunset casting a warm glow on his face, when he pulled out the ring. I said yes before he even finished asking. When we shared the news with my parents, Aunt Patricia cried, and Uncle Robert pulled Michael into a tight hug. "Welcome to the family, son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. From then on, we all dove into wedding planning. Aunt Patricia and I spent days touring venues, picking fabrics, and tasting cakes, while Uncle Robert and Michael handled the budgets and contracts with vendors. It was during this time that I received a message on Facebook that completely caught me off guard. "Catherine, dear, I heard about your upcoming wedding. I know it's been a long time, but I'm still your mother. I've changed, and I want to make things right. Please let me be part of your special day. I miss you so much." My hands shook as I finished reading the message. Vanessa. My mother. I immediately called Aunt Patricia. "I saw Vanessa yesterday," she said after I told her about the message. Her voice was quiet, but there was tension in it. "Where did you see her?" I asked, struggling to keep my emotions in check. "At the grocery store," she replied. "She didn't ask about you, not once. But when I mentioned how successful you've become and that you're planning your wedding, her eyes lit up. And I didn't like it one bit." Aunt Patricia paused before continuing. "Catherine, she has a son now. Madison, do you remember her? She got pregnant, married some deadbeat, and then moved back in with Vanessa and Richard. They're all living there together. From what I've heard, they're constantly fighting. Vanessa even complained about money troubles in the middle of the store." Each of Aunt Patricia's words hit like a blow. "So, she wants money," I whispered, more to myself than to her. "I think so," Aunt Patricia said calmly. After that conversation, I stared at my phone for a long time. The message from Vanessa glowed on the screen. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, ready to type a reply, but I didn't know what to say. Two opposing forces battled within me. Part of me wanted to give her a chance, but another part remembered everything she had done, and failed to do, for me. What does she really want? Money or reconciliation? I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. As memories came flooding back, I was transported to that moment when my mother gave me away on my 13th birthday. Every word, every feeling of hurt and loneliness came rushing back. She had abandoned me. Years of silence. She had so many chances to reach out, but she never did. I exhaled deeply and began typing, each word sharp as a blade. "Vanessa, let me be clear, you are not my mother. You lost that right when you gave me away on my 13th birthday. I have parents who love me unconditionally, the way you never could. I don't want you at my wedding. I don't want you in my life. Do not contact me again." I hit send, froze for a moment, then quickly blocked her. My hands were steady, and my mind was clear. For the first time in years, I felt an invisible weight lift off my shoulders. I felt free at last. The morning of my wedding was as bright and clear as my life had been in recent years. The Mason Creek estate, where the ceremony was taking place, looked magical. Expansive gardens, manicured pathways, and a restored Victorian mansion. It was straight out of a postcard. Michael's parents had rented the venue for us, and their generosity seemed boundless. I stood in front of the mirror in my bridal suite. My dress was perfect, pure white, with a lace bodice and a soft silk skirt that flowed gracefully to the floor. Aunt Patricia adjusted my veil, her smile radiating so much warmth and pride that I nearly started crying. We laughed as we chatted about the final details of the ceremony when there was a knock at the door. "Miss Stevenson?" The guard stood at the doorway, looking uneasy. "I'm sorry to bother you, but there's been an unexpected situation at the front gate." There are people outside claiming to know you. My stomach tightened into a hard knot. I knew who it was. Of course, I knew. I'll handle it, I said, standing up. Aunt Patricia opened her mouth to protest, but I stopped her with a gesture. I need to put an end to this once and for all. I walked down the cobblestone path toward the main gate, my heels clicking in time with the pounding of my heart. And there they were. Vanessa. Richard. And the boy, he had to be my half-brother. He looked like a younger version of Madison, the same smug expression, but with an undercurrent of uncertainty in his movements. Catherine. Vanessa shrieked, clutching the iron bars of the gate. Her voice was loud, piercing, full of indignation. How dare you not invite your own mother to your wedding? Let us in this instant. I stopped a few steps away from the gate and, for the first time in years, allowed myself to really look at her. She had aged, and not well. Her clothes, once designer, were last season's cast-offs. Her makeup was garish, and her hair was in desperate need of a touch-up. Richard stood beside her, looking gaunt, his expensive suits replaced with something cheap and ill-fitting. Richard should have been the one to walk you down the aisle. Vanessa continued. He's your father. How dare you deny him that right? I laughed. The sound came naturally, almost liberating. My father? I repeated, tilting my head. The man who locked me in a room for 2 days. Who helped toss me out of his life. That's what you call fatherly care? Vanessa flinched but pressed on. We're family. You can't just pretend we don't exist. Look at how you live. This lavish wedding, your big job, your fancy clothes. And here we are, barely scraping by. We're drowning in debt, and you're here playing princess. There it was. The real reason they were here. Money. I lifted my chin, looking at her coldly, and said, I'm not playing anything, Vanessa. I earned everything I have. Every penny. And let's be clear, you are not my family. You lost that right a long time ago. My family is the people in that house. They raised me, supported me, and loved me unconditionally. Do you want something from me? Her face contorted, and her voice wavered. You just want money, I interrupted. But you won't get any. Leave. Leave now, and don't come back. Richard stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. You can't do this to us, he spat, but I had already turned away. I can, I said, walking back toward the house. And I will. When I returned, Aunt Patricia pulled me into a tight, silent hug. Michael stood nearby, his eyes full of quiet support. I had made my choice, and for the first time in my life, I was certain it was the right one. Behind me, Vanessa's voice rang out, shaking with rage and indignation. After everything we've done for you, you have no right to treat us this way. I turned to face her, my expression calm and cold. Everything you've done for me? I replied. You mean how you threw me away like trash? How you took my room, my home, my childhood? That's what you've done for me. Vanessa opened her mouth as if to argue, but I raised my hand to stop her. Turning to the guards, I said, These people are trespassers. Please escort them off the property. They're not welcome here. You can't do this. Vanessa screamed as the guards moved toward the gate. I'm your mother. I paused for a moment to meet her gaze and said firmly, clearly, leaving no room for doubt. No. You're just the woman who gave birth to me. And that's where it ends. Her shouts continued, but I turned my back and walked away, my head held high. Her voice grew fainter with each step, and with each step, I felt stronger. When I returned to the bridal suite, Aunt Patricia looked at me with concern. Are you okay, sweetheart? She asked softly. I took a deep breath, smiled, and replied, You know, I've never been better. That chapter of my life is finally closed for good. At that moment, a gentle knock sounded at the door, and Uncle Robert peeked inside. His face radiated pride. "Ready, princess?" he asked, extending his arm to me. I glanced at myself in the mirror one last time, adjusting my veil. The woman staring back at me was no longer the scared 13-year-old girl. She was strong, confident, and loved. "Yes, Dad," I said, taking his arm. "I'm ready." We walked toward the garden, where the first notes of the wedding march began to play. As we reached the altar, I saw Michael waiting for me. He stood there glowing, his eyes glistening with tears. When our eyes met, I felt it with certainty. Everything in my life had led to this moment. The guests turned to watch as my father walked me down the aisle, the man who taught me how to drive, who spent hours helping me with my college applications, who supported me in everything and showed me what true fatherly love looks like. He held my hand tightly, and just before placing it in Michael's, he whispered softly, "I'm proud of you, Catherine. Always." The ceremony was perfect. Beneath a bright blue sky, surrounded by flowers and the people who loved us deeply and unconditionally, Michael and I exchanged our vows. When he kissed me for the first time as his wife, our guests erupted in cheers and applause. The reception lasted late into the night. Uncle Robert gave a heartfelt speech that made everyone cry, then had the room laughing with awkward stories from my college years. Michael danced with Aunt Patricia, while I twirled around with Uncle Robert, the man I now called Dad forever. I couldn't stop smiling. That was 6 months ago. Michael and I just returned from our honeymoon in Greece, and life has settled into a normal, yet beautiful rhythm. We've begun building our own little family, and every morning I wake up next to a man who loves me with his whole heart. Every Sunday, we have dinner with the parents who chose me and never let me go. Sometimes, people ask me about my real parents, and I always answer honestly, my real parents are the ones who loved me and shaped me into the person I am today. I've heard rumors that Vanessa and her family were forced to sell my father's old house. They mean nothing to me now, just distant shadows from a past that no longer holds any power over me. My story isn't about being abandoned or betrayed, it's about how I found my true family. About the people who chose me not because they had to, but because they wanted to. It's a story about forgiveness, happiness, and moving forward. Now, I am Catherine Stevenson Mitchell. And I couldn't be happier.